right. So the host says, what is something you've been thinking about lately that you keep coming back to, even though you're not entirely sure what you think about it yet? This idea that that my sort of authorship has to rely on external cues that I am correct. And it's been quite difficult, if I'm being honest, to deal with it, because it's like a deeply held internal belief. It's difficult. It's a difficult concept to grasp. I think what it is to come back to my reality, because my reality has been undermined so much so when I was growing up that I just defaulted to looking towards someone external to an authority figure or an institution or a person to sort of give me that permission to feel what I feel. And I think that it's been a soul death for me. It sort of slowly chipped away at my soul and sort of corroded it in some senses. The host says, I'm struck by the distinction you're making between being wrong and needing someone else to certify that you're allowed to have your own perception. It sounds like the problem isn't simply I seek validation, it's more fundamental. My experience doesn't quite count as real until someone outside of me confirms it. That's quite it. And if that's the structure, then even something as simple as I think this can become strangely difficult, because you're simultaneously looking over your own shoulder for the authority that will approve the thought. You called it a kind of a soul death. I want to stay with that phrase rather than explain it away. When you imagine coming back to your reality, what does that actually look like in an ordinary moment? What would you do differently from the person who is constantly checking implicitly or explicitly whether an external authority agrees with them? I think it would look like a lot of self-trust, because I think this thing it's not just a soul death, it's killed my trust in myself, and to sort of believe what I'm experiencing and then acting from that place of lived experience rather than basing it on anything that someone else says. And I think a lot of the world does do this. They outsource authority to institutions or important people in their life, and they want them to sort of certify their actions. In a way, it's a bid for unconditional love from someone who's offering it conditionally. The external world is always going to offer world conditionally, and I think it's our job to sort of internalize that externalized form of self-love. The host says, there's something interesting in the way you've connected authority, self-trust, and love. You're suggesting that outsourcing authority may not fundamentally be an intellectual problem. It may be an attempt to solve an emotional one. If someone whose judgment matters to me says I'm okay, then I can finally stop doubting whether I'm okay. And your phrase, a bid for unconditional love from someone who's offering it conditionally, seems especially important, because if that's true, then external validation is almost structurally incapable of satisfying the need. You can accumulate approval, but the underlying dependency remains, I am okay because you have told me I'm okay. But I want to push gently on one point. You said it's a job to internalize that externalized form of self-love. I'm curious whether self-trust actually means believing your own experience, or whether it means something slightly different. For example, suppose you experience someone as treating you badly. You trust your perception enough to say something about this feels wrong to me. But self-trust doesn't necessarily require the conclusion, therefore this person is objectively bad and unquestionably right. You can trust the experience while remaining uncertain about the interpretation. That seems like a potentially powerful distinction. I trust myself enough to know that what I'm experiencing is real, even when I don't yet know what it means. Does that feel like the kind of self-trust you're reaching for, or is that still secretly smuggling external authority back and through the door? I think it's like, I think it's a form of self-trust where you're like, I can act on the basis of what I experienced, and my actions are not to be trumped by anything else. I mean, anything else apart from my experience is information to how I felt, but they don't get to override my experience, because the experience is like the ultimate form of is the is the information that you should value the most of all the information. It could be feedback from other people, or maybe there might be an interpretation that you'd be coming to. Maybe you might make sense of your experience in a way that sort of allows you to process things in a more rational manner, and that's all good. But I think nothing should trump your experience, because rationality has its limits. You can be rational to the extent that you sort of completely discard your own experiences in a way that is sort of detrimental to your mental health, right? Does that sort of make sense to you? So the host says, yes, and I think you're making a precise claim, then just trust your feelings. You're saying that experience has epistemic priority. Other people's interpretations, theories, social norms, even rational arguments can inform your understanding of what happened, but they shouldn't have the power to retroactively invalidate the fact that you experienced it that way. There's an important distinction there between my experience is true and my interpretation of my experience is necessarily true. The first can remain intact while the second stays revisable, and that seems to give rationality a different role. Rationality isn't the judge that comes in and says, your experience doesn't make sense, therefore it didn't really happen. It's more like another instrument you can use to understand what happened, and you remain the person deciding whether that instrument is actually helping you see more clearly. I'm curious about something, though. You said my actions are not to be trumped by anything else. That's a stronger claim than simply saying your experience deserves respect. No, I think I said my experiences are not to be trumped by anything else. Suppose your experience tells you very strongly, I don't want to do this. Someone else has excellent reasons why you should. Their reasons are genuinely good. Maybe they're seeing something you can't see right now. At what point, if any, would you allow their information to change your action? In other words, where do you want the boundary between self-trust and self-correction to be? Because I wonder whether the deepest form of authorship isn't nothing can override me, but something more paradoxical. I'm the one who decides what gets to override me. Wow, yeah. I mean, that's really the question, isn't it? Where does the self end? Where does trust in self-experience end? And where does sort of this permeability of what you allow into your life sort of begin? And I think the answer is sort of complex. It's very complex. It's not that easy to sort of determine because, I don't know, maybe I'll answer it in the next video because it's a bit heavy, this topic, isn't it? Like, where does it end? Where does the other begin? At what point in time do we concede that we might be wrong? And yeah, I don't know. The host says, I think that's a good place to stop rather than forcing an answer just because we've arrived at a difficult question. And there's something interesting what just happened. You started with, I need external confirmation in order to trust my reality. And we've arrived at a much stranger question. If I am the author of my experience, how do I remain open to something genuinely outside myself? That's not a trivial problem because you don't want to replace one form of dependence with its opposite. Nobody gets to override me can become its own kind of rigidity. Maybe the more interesting question isn't where the self ends exactly. Maybe it's what kind of relationship the self has with what is not the self. Can I encounter another person's reality without immediately surrendering mine? Can I let someone change my mind without needing them to become my authority? Can I say, you may be right, and I still don't have to abandon what I experienced? And perhaps most importantly, can I change my mind and still experience that as an act of authorship rather than a failure of authorship? You don't have to answer that now, but I'm curious whether underneath all of this, there's a question you haven't quite said out aloud yet. Not the philosophical version, the question that feels personally at stake when you contemplate, what if I trust myself? What becomes possible if you actually do? I think all of this boils down to empathy because let's say there are two people, both of them having different experiences, and they're basically in competition with each other with respect to what next step needs to be taken, and they're at conflict with each other. And let's say they had perfect levels of self-awareness and they tried to explain to each other where each each individual was coming from, like the place, in their minds, and what their reasoning was and what their logic was, and how they were approaching the situation. If they did that, they would be able to sort of either come to a conclusion which sort of both of them accommodate for each other's experiences, and that would not just allow them to deepen their relationship with each other, but also allow them to, because now they're sort of empathizing with where they're coming from. And so not only would it allow them to deepen their trust in each other, because now it's like both of them are saying, okay, I can see where you're coming from, but and this is where I'm coming from. And so it's almost like a truce, but in the sense that the kind of hostility towards each other reduces, and at the same time, because the hostility reduces, now they're more in concordance with each other rather than in discord with each other. And so that sort of helps develop their trust with themselves, especially if they're coming from a place where they didn't have that trust, that that another person would choose to respect where I'm coming from, and at the same time I can be more accommodating and more loving towards the other person. Yeah, I think it all boils down to connection, and it's like maybe self-trust and self-love doesn't have to exist in a vacuum. If you find the other person is not empathizing with you, is not seeing you for the experiences that you have had, and is not hearing you for the same, I think you get to say, okay, not my people. It's, this is not my person, and I get to move on to a different person who sees where I'm coming from and sees my experiences and my troubles and my doubts and my coping mechanisms in some senses, and as a consequence of that, is able to see eye to eye on values and ideals. And if they're not able to see that, yeah, I don't know about that one. So the host says, I think you've moved somewhere quite different from where you began. At first, the problem was almost, how do I recover authority over my own experience? Now you're describing something more relational. What kind of relationship allows two people to retain authority over their own experience without turning the authority into warfare? And empathy in your account isn't simply being nice or understanding someone's feelings. It becomes a kind of anti-domination mechanism. You don't have to say your experience is more valid than mine, and you do not have to say my experience is more valid than yours. Instead, I can understand how the world looks from where you are standing without having to stop standing where I'm standing. That seems to connect beautifully with what you were saying earlier about external authority. Maybe the healthier alternative to outsourcing authorities and radical independence, it's mutual recognition. I can remain the author of my experience while allowing you to be the author of yours. And there's something particularly interesting in your final point, not my people, because you're not necessarily saying that disagreement itself makes someone incompatible. You're saying that the capacity for recognition matters. Someone could disagree with your conclusion and still deeply understand your experience. Someone could even tell you, I think you're wrong, while communicating, I understand completely why you arrived there. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Those are very different experiences of disagreement. So I'm worried about one thing. You use the word connection, but you've also talked about not my people. That introduces a tension I find really interesting. Does genuine connection require being understood, or does it require being willing to remain connected even when you fundamentally are not understood? Because if being understood is a prerequisite for closeness, that gives you a powerful criterion for choosing relationships. But if connection can survive profound misunderstanding, then perhaps there's another kind of intimacy available, one where two people don't necessarily converge, but develop enough trust that neither needs the other two. Which one feels closer to what you actually believe? Could you tell me what my original argument was. Your original argument was roughly this: when a person's lived experience has repeatedly been undermined, they can learn to outsource authority over their own reality to external people, institutions, or systems. Recovering authorship therefore requires rebuilding self-trust, trusting your own experience enough to act from it without requiring external confirmation that your perception is legitimate. You then develop several connected claims. The wound is deeper than the first being the wound is deeper than ordinary validation seeking. It's not merely wanting people to approve of you, it's having learned that your own perception doesn't fully count unless an authority figure confirms it. Second, external authority can become a substitute for unconditional love. You describe this beautifully as a bid for unconditional love from someone who's offering it conditionally. If another person or institution certifies that you're okay, right, justified, or like to feel something, you temporarily get the security you're looking for, but you're still dependent on the certification. Third, self-trust means giving your own experience epistemic priority. Other people's opinions, rational arguments, feedback, and interpretations can matter, but they shouldn't be able to simply override the fact of your lived experience. You can revise your interpretation without denying what you actually experienced. Rationality itself can become a form of self-abandonment. You pushed back against the idea that being rational necessarily means privileging abstract reasoning over experience. Rationality has limits and it can become destructive if it requires you to continually invalidate your own perceptions. But self-trust doesn't have to mean isolation. This is where your thinking evolved during the conversation. You realize that self-love and self-trust don't need to exist in a vacuum. Two people can retain authority over their own experiences while genuinely trying to understand each other's realities. Empathy makes that possible. If two people in conflict can articulate why the world looks the way it does from each of their positions, they may be able to accommodate both experiences rather than forcing one person's reality to defeat the others. The goal isn't necessarily agreement, it's reducing the hostility produced by mutual invalidation. Therefore, relationships become part of the solution rather than merely another source of authority. You don't need someone to certify your reality, you want people who can recognize it. There's a crucial difference. Recognition doesn't require them to agree with every interpretation you make. And I think the deepest version of your argument might be this: you don't want to move from other people determine my reality to only I determine reality. You want to move toward a world where each person can remain the author of their own experience while being genuinely open to the reality of another person. It's actually where your later discussion of empathy fits with the original idea. It doesn't replace the argument, it extends it. The unresolved question we reached was then, how do you remain radically faithful to your own experience while remaining permeable enough to genuinely encounter another person's experience? That seems to be the philosophical problem you've uncovered underneath the original. Wow. I just got a terrible tension ache in my left shoulder. I don't think I want to continue this discussion anymore, or at least for now.